This is the 21st episode of an analysis series exploring the 2012 film Prometheus from Ridley Scott. I am the Film Symbologist. In this video, I will discuss what the being at the waterfall in the opening scene is ingesting. What is this golden goo? What does it do to the engineer, and what does his act mean for the story? By the end of the video, you should better understand what the mutagen is, what it does, and how it works. In previous installments, I've explored who the engineers on LV-223 are, what the black goo is, and where the opening scene takes place. If you haven't seen past episodes in the series, I suggest checking them out. For early access to new videos on YouTube, to support the creation of new content, and to help improve production quality, consider becoming a member of the channel. Links are in the description.
What is that?
Probably some fucked up bioweapon, I'm sure.
Actually, quite the opposite.
In episode 16, I described the black goo as a survival aid, a developmental accelerant. Just as gasoline can act as an accelerant for fire, but cannot generate fire on its own, the goo seems to act as a pathogen capable of altering existing life, but not of creating new life. The goo on LV-223 does not appear to affect inorganic machines like David, and it does not appear to change the underlying DNA of the biological creatures it comes into contact with. Interpreted through Hermeticism, the goo can be understood as the Negrito, the first stage in the alchemical magnum opus process, which can lead to the philosopher's stone and elixir of life. From one perspective, the black goo seems to provide some short-term benefits. From another perspective, the goo is a punishment leading to other longer-term consequences. The pathogen on LV-223 provides a means of attaining fire, knowledge, and immortality, but at the expense of one's own agency, breath, and spirit. The black goo may, like gasoline, be a natural resource, or more likely, it may be an experimental substance containing the blood, DNA, and other components of species from across the universe. In any case, the pyramids on LV-223 seem to be involved in the production and preparation of the black goo through some kind of refinement or manufacturing process that culminates in the ceremonial animation of the pathogen with the green crystal, ahead of it being loaded into the cargo bay of the juggernauts. The so-called engineers on LV-223 can be seen as rebellious alchemists, hell-bent on liberating themselves from various restraints. While they share some characteristics with the Olympian gods from Greek mythology, they are also similar to the Titans. And while the goo in the opening scene at the waterfall is like the black goo in some ways, there are also several important differences that are worth discussing. When the lid to the saucer is removed and the contents of the cup are exposed to the atmosphere, the goo begins to change. As light interacts with the goo, I see reflections of silver and gold, which is why, for the purposes of this analysis, I will refer to this substance as the golden goo. In episode 20, I described the scene at the waterfall as depicting an act of God. I also argue that the opening scene takes place on LV-223, and it shows the incident that annihilated the engineers on LV-223 2,000 years prior to the Weyland Corporation expedition. Under this view, it wasn't an off-screen accidental outbreak of the black goo, but rather a deliberate act of judgment shown on screen that caused the cataclysmic event on the moon world. In episode 2, I stated that all the events in the film occur within a roughly 37,000 year timeline, including the event at the opening scene. I wasn't lying. The opening scene doesn't occur hundreds of thousands or millions of years in the past at the beginning of a story. It occurs in the 1st century AD, in medias res, or in the middle of a larger series of events. While I was being honest about the timeline of the film in episode 2, there are other examples where I'm admittedly guilty of misleading viewers. For example, in episodes 10, 11, and 12, I offered interpretations of the film's story for which there is some evidence, but which don't adequately account for the green crystal, the so-called star maps, and the effects of the black goo. In those videos, I presented the being at the waterfall as representative of the Titan Prometheus, the serpent in the garden, and an experimental cosmic gardener of life. The golden goo was described as a substance that transforms biology, aids the survival of existing creatures, and imparts knowledge to early humans. In more recent videos, however, I've established that these descriptions are more reflective of the LV-223 engineers and the black goo than they are of the cloaked engineer and the golden goo. If, as I argued in episode 20, the opening scene depicts the catastrophic event on LV-223 that prevented the engineers from carrying out their mission to Earth, how exactly does the being from the round ship accomplish this? How does this golden goo work, and what does it do? In addition to what we see on screen, we are also offered a clue in the extra features of the Blu-ray box set. To my knowledge, the only full script that is available, and has also been authenticated, is Jonathan Spaihts' Alien Engineer's screenplay for the prequel film. There are a few other scripts floating around that purport to be Lindelof's screenplays, but it is my understanding that these are actually fan-made. However, the home release extras do contain a partial excerpt from a single page of Lindelof's Prometheus script. As far as I know, this is the only legitimate fragment of the film's screenplay that is available. This screenplay excerpt describes a version of Prometheus's opening scene that is similar to the alternate version with the group of elders that was filmed but not included in the theatrical cut. In the script excerpt, the elder speaks to the younger engineer, saying, "Let your body become the dirt, your blood become the waters, and may your soul become their way back to us." How should we interpret this? Does this sound like something that would be said when new life is being seeded? The elder implies that existing life has strayed from a path and needs to be brought back in line. Perhaps existing life is being reprogrammed in some way by the act at the waterfall. Or maybe the engineer is carrying out a punishment of sorts. But whatever it is that he's doing to himself, he seems to be doing it willingly. In episode 16, I described Holloway as the prima materia, or alchemical raw material, that undergoes a transformative magnum opus process. The scientist is unknowingly infected with the black goo, which initiates the first of 4 stages, the negrito, or blackening, that is characterized by despair and decomposition. In the second albedo, or whitening stage, Holloway's infected seed somehow manages to impregnate an otherwise infertile Shaw. In the third stage, Holloway is succumbing to his infection and becoming a monster until he receives fire from Vickers and dies. Fifield faces a similar fate. The second to last stage, the citrinitas or yellowing, is also defined by Holloway's trilobite offspring, face-hugging the engineer. In Rubido, the reddening or final stage, a philosopher's stone and immortal beast emerge from the engineer's torso. The Wayland Corporation crew seems to unleash one version of the magnum opus with the black goo. The engineer in the opening scene seems to be undergoing a similar process with the golden goo. Unlike Holloway, the being at the waterfall voluntarily ingests the contents of the cup with some apparent foreknowledge of what would happen. The engineer is the prima materia that is to be transformed. Upon consuming the golden goo, the first phase is initiated, which leads to the decomposition of his flesh, beginning with wounds on his hands, a black liquid flowing along and through his body, and the breaking down of his DNA. The second phase is characterized by duality, not unlike the spiraling double helixes on screen, and purification of the pale white engineer in the rushing water. The next phase can be associated with the spirit or soul, with being anointed by oil, and with experiencing an awakening, which we see in the formation of new strands of yellow DNA. The final phase is linked to fire, wisdom, and individuation as represented in the replicating red cells. This engineer's body became dirt, and his blood became water. But what of his soul? Has the engineer seeded the building blocks of new life on an otherwise barren planet? Has he released something into the water that has the power to genetically reprogram existing life on this world? Is it a virus aimed at infecting wayward creatures as a punishment? Is that what we're shown in the opening sequence? A pathogen being dispersed? I don't think so. The golden goo is more like a mutagen. It doesn't just modify the engineer. The goo completely breaks down his DNA and rebuilds it into something new. This goo appears much more powerful than the black stuff in the pyramids. The contents of the cup isn't Prometheus's fire or the evils from Pandora's jar. The golden goo can instead be seen as the will of God. The engineer is God's emissary, the Logos in biological form, and his act of God is motivated by a divine breath and spirit. I imagine this goo is bitter tasting, and in the moments after ingesting it, the audience sees the engineer suffering. He is experiencing God's wrath. Ridley Scott's film depicts two distinct processes that are initiated by goos and that lead to two versions of transformation. One is initiated by the black pathogen, the other by the golden mutagen. The goo from the urns seems to alter existing creatures, reverting them to base instincts and making them nearly indestructible. The goo from the saucer is a bit more mysterious. The scene is cut short before we really see what happens, but I think we're shown enough. The engineer at the waterfall dies. His DNA is completely destroyed, but we see it building back up into something else. Cells are growing and multiplying. A new being is forming. As interesting as the ovomorphs, facehuggers, and xenomorphs are, they've been the subjects of countless films, stories, and comics over the last 5 decades. Prometheus brings something new to the table. Not only does the film shift focus to the space jockey, it also opens up entirely new mysteries. We know what falls into the waterfall in the opening scene of Scott's movie. But the most interesting question in the alien universe to me is about what emerges out of that water. We know that some new life form is growing, but what? Another humanoid engineer? A xenomorph-related creature? It is left almost entirely up to the audience to imagine and speculate. We aren't given many clues. Artists and creative types are free to explore unique visions, concepts, and designs. While the possibilities are nearly endless, there are few things that I think we can be certain about. Whatever being emerges from the water must terrify the LV-223 engineers. So much so that the engineers would hurry their efforts to load the urns into the juggernauts and rush their departure to Earth, and in the process accidentally unleash some of the goo. Or maybe some of the engineers on LV-223, in an act of desperation, decided to intentionally release the black goo in a last-ditch effort to fight the being that resulted from the act at the waterfall. The last engineer who remained alive in his hypersleep chamber may have gone under before any of this occurred. The other engineers in the pilot's chamber may have tried to go into cryosleep after all hell had broken loose and they'd already been infected. The engineers in the hallway recording may have been turning into Fifield-like monsters, while also running from Deacon-like creatures that were created to fight whatever emerged from the water. This explanation provides a fourth scenario for understanding the so-called outbreak on LV-223, to accompany the three other possibilities that were discussed in episode 20. Like many aspects of Ridley Scott's film, drawing concrete conclusions about the nature of the event that led to the engineer's death on LV-223 is challenging. Likewise, it's difficult to determine the purposes of the two goos. To a substantial extent, it's subjective. From the engineer's perspective, the black goo may be a survival aid, like fire. From humanity's perspective, it can seem like a punishment similar to the evils in Pandora's jar. From the perspective of the cloaked engineer at the waterfall, the golden goo may preserve life on Earth, while it simultaneously brings death to LV-223. If the opening scene at the waterfall does in fact occur on the moon world, and it immediately precedes the incident that prevents the engineers from bringing the black goo to Earth, then how exactly does this occur? I like to imagine what emerges out of the water is a great eagle-like being, capable of quickly traversing across the skies and surface of the moon, confining the engineers to their rock, and punishing them by swooping in and ripping out their innards. But what do you imagine? Let me know in the comments down below. In a future video, I will discuss why the being at the waterfall may have wanted to prevent the LV-223 engineers from going to Earth. In the next installment in the Prometheus series, I will explore the character of Elizabeth Shaw and her relationship to David. For early access to new videos, to help improve production quality, and to support the creation of new content, consider becoming a paid member on my YouTube channel or Patreon, where you can also access ad-free videos. Until next time, this has been the Film Symbologist. Thanks for watching.